So my name's Heather. Welcome back to my channel. And I'm really happy to have another guest on. And it's my friend and comrade, Liz Davies. So, hello, Liz.
Hello, Heather. It's lovely to be here.
Good. Yeah, lovely to have you here. We were saying we should start with how we met each other, which was through the Corbyn Project, because we both left the Labour Party under Tony Blair's leadership. And we both came back under Jeremy Corbyn's. And then we ended up in Momentum Hackney together.
And I have a very vivid memory of you. I think it may have been the first time that I met you, when we had an urgent Hackney Momentum meeting at the time of all those resignations from the Shadow Cabinet in June 2016, what later became called the chicken coup. And we met together, and there were about 50 very upset people in the room who wanted to work out how best to support Jeremy and make sure that he wasn't toppled. And you were organising that meeting, facilitating that meeting. You were standing literally in the middle of the room as everyone was sitting around, and you channeled all that upset and anger that people were feeling into working out what we should do, which was go to our local Labour parties in Hackney North and Hackney South, and make a fuss and put resolutions and so forth.
Yeah, that was an amazing meeting because it was called right at the last minute, for obvious reasons. But actually, I remember meeting you a little bit earlier in Labour Representation Committee I think I remember that because I knew who you were, vaguely. You know, I didn't really remember all the details, but I remembered from the first time around at the Labour Party in the 1990s. Liz Davies's name, and then suddenly you were introduced. I was like, oh wow, I'm actually in the room with someone kind of famous.
One or the other, yes.
Yes. So do you want to tell people about the way that you kind of became famous or infamous?
I became infamous or notorious or had my 15 minutes of fame, however you want to put it, in 1995, when I was selected democratically by Leeds North East Labour Party members to stand as their parliamentary candidate. At the time, I had been a member of the Labour Party since 1979 when I was 16, and I was a Labour councillor in Islington, and I had been a Labour councillor for 5 years. I had another 3 years to run. And I'd had some run-ins with Margaret Hodge, who was leader of the council when I first got elected, but I was a Labour councillor in good standing. I fought the parliamentary selection from a left-wing perspective. That's why left-wing Labour Party members in Leeds North East had asked me to stand. They wanted somebody who would speak for the ideals of Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn and people like that. Tony Blair had been leader of the Labour Party at that point for a year, and he'd just abolished Clause 4. And I was democratically selected, and then within a few days, the Tony Blair's propaganda machine leaked to the newspapers that I would not be endorsed by the NEC, which is a formal procedure that the NEC endorses parliamentary selections. There had been no precedent for an NEC refusing to endorse a candidate where she'd been properly selected before. In the past, it had always been where there was some procedural problem with the selection, or where more recently where MPs had been members of the militant tendency and so forth, which I wasn't. I was on the left wing of the party. So for about 3 months, that became quite a high profile Labour case. It went as far as Labour Party conference. I was denounced from the platform, and there was a voting on a motion that was brought by Leeds North East, who'd selected me in Islington North constituency, which is where I was a member, and they were calling for my selection to be ratified. But the National Executive Committee just said, we're not going to give any reasons why this woman should not be selected, but we would not be endorsed, but we're not endorsing her, and that was that. It was very clear that what Blair wanted to do at the time was use that particular selection as sending a message to left-wingers in the Labour Party that whilst there might be some left-wing MPs in the Parliamentary Labour Party, Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn, and so Diane Abbott, indeed, in Hackney North, that the door was very firmly closed to new left-wing candidates getting into Parliament. So I became famous or infamous for 3 months as a result of that. The good news part of my story is that 3 years later, there were some complicated procedural changes about who could run for the National Executive Committee, which resulted in 6 seats being vacant. There were no incumbents, and only people who were not MPs could run. In other words, the vast majority of the party membership could run, but those seats had previously all been held by MPs. So a number of groups from the kind of centre of the Labour Party and the traditional left of the Labour Party got together, and we formed something that we called the Centre-Left Grassroots Alliance, which is still with us to its day. And we ran 6 candidates for the 6 seats on the Labour Party's NEC, and I was one of those candidates, and we won 4 of the seats. Party members voted for us in a democratic 1-member, 1-vote ballot. And I have to say, Blair had been quite paranoid about us getting elected. He'd written articles in the Sunday press about how the Labour Party was, there was no room in the Labour Party for people like myself and Mark Seddon, who was editor of Tribune, who topped the poll, in fact. So it was a real vindication to having been rejected by the Blair machine to standing from Parliament, to then get elected by ordinary party members using 1-member, 1-vote onto the ruling body of the Labour Party. And it was both, I then spent 2 years on the National Executive Committee, and it was both a very weird experience and a fairly grueling one. It was very odd, but I got to sit opposite the table from Blair and look at him and try and analyse the man to some extent. Of course, I didn't know what horrors were going to come. I left the National Executive Committee in 2001, shortly before 9/11, and obviously well before Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've said there is really one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you for a video, because my feeling is that a lot of people who joined the party in 2015, 2016, 2017, even 2018 and 2019, had no real knowledge or experience of the Labour Party before that, except kind of quite vaguely, no specific experience as a member, and kind of felt like, didn't understand, I suppose, the way in which what happened during Corbyn's time was so unusual for the Labour Party. And actually what's happening under Keir Starmer is much more typical. And I think like your experience and the fact that you were so inside it as a councillor, as briefly a sort of parliamentary candidate, but not quite, and then on the National Executive for a couple of years under Blair, and of course as a grassroots member for a very long time, really like helps us to learn like from the history of that, shows us parallels between what happened under Blair, what's happening under Starmer, indeed what happened earlier in the Labour Party. This is not the first time the left has been under attack. It's not the first time there's been purges. I mean, like authoritarian Labour leaders who love to attack the left and get their kicks from it is the history of the party, right?
Going back to Bevan making that terrible U-turn on nuclear policy and talking about going naked into the conference chamber, and every biography I've read of Bevan never really explains why that happens. I think the influx of new members in 2015, 2016, inspired by Jeremy, and let's be clear, it was wholly inspiring. It was a wonderful moment. Broadly fell into 2 groups, and there were people like you and me who had previously been in the Labour Party and had left it, usually over Blair, around that time, but had been to a lesser or greater extent activists at some point in the 80s or the 90s. And then there was a whole new generation, a much younger generation, a generation who, when they were becoming politically active, it would not have occurred to them to join the Labour Party because they'd been demonstrating against the Iraq War, which a Labour government had promulgated, had invaded Iraq. They had been demonstrating against student fees. That was obviously the coalition government, but they didn't hold out much hope of Labour. And indeed, they even saw during the first leadership election, Labour in 2015, Labour abstaining on the two-child limit on welfare benefits. They were horrified by all that. They were inspired by Jeremy to join the Labour Party, and that was great. What it meant, though, and I think this was a good thing, but it produced real clashes, is that younger generation came into a party that is deeply bureaucratic, has a very complicated decision-making structure and an administrative structure. And you and I both delved into the admin. We'll talk about that in a moment. And a lot of those people had come from much more horizontal decision-making in political activity. And I think they found it really hard, and I think they found it really unwelcoming. And the other side of the coin is that those party members who had stayed in the party, who had kept those structures going, remember a majority of party members in 2015 voted for Jeremy Corbyn. So it's not the case that suddenly all these new Corbynites turn up and party members don't understand them and don't share their politics. Party members wanted to see the change of direction that Jeremy Corbyn represented. But I do think that existing party members some of them found it quite difficult to respond to a demand for a sort of more horizontal based decision making that those new activists brought in with them. And I deeply regret that. I think that was something that we should have, those of us who are older and were used to it and were coming back, should have thought a little more about how to help people become engaged in the Labour Party and how to avoid the fights, except where the fights were necessary. I have to say the fights were on the whole generated by the right wing, which takes us back to how we first met in Hackney, which was trying to organise to defend Jeremy around the chicken coop. We had to have those fights. We had no choice. We hadn't started them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of the fights were necessary, but yes, there were lots of divisions within the left, and those divisions opened up more and more as time went on. But the other thing I was thinking was, I watched this very old television series, well, not very old, but you know, I didn't watch it in my childhood, but it would have been on then, about a left-wing Labour MP. I'm trying to remember his name, but I'll put it in the description below this video for people to watch it, because it's on YouTube. And in the first episode of that, you follow him getting elected in the by-election. And he's in the pub, and he's talking about CLP meetings. And it struck me that in the 1970s, a peak time ITV audience would not need you to explain what a CLP meeting was. And that it isn't just there's a kind of generational shift. There is just a way in which the ways of organising which happen within left-wing organisations like the Labour Party and trade unions have kind of dropped out of our kind of shared cultural knowledge. And they are a real shock to the system, right? They are, like, even for me who've seen them before, they're hard work.
They really are. They were hard work during the time that you and I were active in Hackney, because the fight that was represented at a national level around Jeremy was going on locally around us as well. But you're right, they are also something that are nowadays completely abstract, not just to ordinary people who aren't politically active, but actually to a lot of people who are politically active as well. Whereas back in the 70s, if you were politically active on the left, you understood what Labour Party structures looked like. I think the other side of the coin of that, though, is that, you know, nowadays we have social media, something unheard of in the 70s and 80s. And I don't suggest that political decision making gets done through social media, but an awful lot of discussion happens through social media. And if you reproduced that series, I'm going to have to check it and see what it is you were watching. But if you reproduced that series nowadays, you would start with the MP sitting at home engaging with people on Twitter, and everyone would understand that.
Okay, so what I think it would be good to do for people then, having talked about some of the similarities and differences, is to delve into that a bit more. So how far is what's happening under Keir Starmer unprecedented? How does it compare with what happened under Tony Blair? What are the differences? Are there any differences?
It's very interesting, and I mean, analogy never works completely historically. So somebody is never the new Blair or the new Kinnock or the new anything else. Keir, and by Keir I mean that as a shorthand for obviously Keir Starmer himself, but also those people who are advising him and who are running the party administration, the General Secretary and the senior directors and so forth. So Keir is a shorthand. But what are they? To a certain extent, there are remnants of Kinnock in them. So if you look, for example, at Starmer prescribing groups, then obviously that was something that Kinnock did very heavily. He prescribed the militant tendency, and I think he may have he certainly smeared other left wingers by association with other groups and so forth. So the prescription starts in the 1980s. Blair didn't prescribe groups, some would argue because he didn't need to, because insofar as there were any groups, they were wholly ineffective, and the left was getting smashed by Blair anyway. What Blair did was two things. One is he did change the formal decision-making structure of the party, so that there used to be a fairly simple route from a party member turning up at their local constituency party, putting a motion on an issue, an issue of policy, whatever it was, whether it's unilateral nuclear disarmament or whether it was housing policy or whatever you care to name. And theoretically, formally, that motion could get as far as the floor of conference and be voted upon, and it would then be Labour Party policy, although that didn't mean it would necessarily be in the Labour Party manifesto for government. Now, in fact, politics is far more complicated than that, and it took an awful lot to get motions through and onto the floor of conference and then passed by conference. But formally, that route was there. And what Blair did was he changed that. So he tore up the rule book, and he said that policymaking was going to be done by a different body, thing we still have, called the National Policy Forum. The elections to that were somewhat opaque. Ken Livingstone at the time described the structure as looking like a demented octopus. And it meant that it was, whilst the National Policy Forum, and indeed just before I came on this video, I've been trying to write a submission about the housing policy for today's National Policy Forum. Whilst the National Policy Forum received submissions from organisations, from constituencies, from individuals, in that respect, it's quite horizontal. It's impossible to find out how they sift those submissions and turn them into policy. So that was quite an important piece of change that Blair undertook. And since then, under Miliband and Corbyn, we've had a bit more of the power of conference restored, but only a little bit. And the other thing Blair did, which in fact goes back to the early 90s, before Blair became leader, was the introduction of one member, one vote, which the left at the time opposed, and I was part of that opposition, but very quickly it became obvious that we were wrong about that. And that one member, one vote was not only more democratic, and you should support something for that reason alone, but also actually ordinary party members were much more progressive than the party machine. So, and that's not a reason for supporting a change, that's a factional reason, but it so turned out that one member, one vote started to benefit the left, which Blair didn't anticipate. And most obviously in 2015, the Parliamentary Labour Party did not anticipate, because one member, one vote produced Jeremy Corbyn as leader. So there were a number of formal changes. The other thing that Blair did brilliantly was the system of patronage. And obviously all political parties have had patronage. The Labour Party and patronage goes back a very long way. The Labour Party has always put people in the House of Lords. They've always lined up safe seats for people. They've that level of patronage, working out who might be a safe pair of hands to run a Labour council, that sort of thing has always been there. But Blair was really very good at patronage. And the result of that was that when you had the huge result, the landslide in 1997 of the vast numbers of new Labour MPs, and they were new Labour MPs because they all wanted to get on under Blair. And Blair made it very clear that voices of dissent would not be tolerated. My case was actually quite an important example about that, because not only the decision to endorse me not only said we won't endorse other left-wingers, but it followed that other left-wingers were deterred from putting their names forward for selection because they just, and friends of mine said, well, it happened to you, it's going to happen to us, what's the point? And people in constituencies said, we'd love to put so-and-so forward, but we're sure she won't be endorsed by the NEC because she's got your politics, Liz. So there was a self-selecting element to that people who were elected in 1997 wanted to have the approval of the leader. And the leader himself took a very binary, you're for us or against us position about the Parliamentary Labour Party. So there was the campaign group, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn till 2001, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell joined them in 97. That was a good thing. But they were kind of like the sealed tomb. At the time, they were described as the sealed tomb, and they were ignored by Blair and the party managers. They spoke up from the back benches. They were important dissident voices, particularly around Iraq and some of the civil liberties infringements that went on around Iraq. They were very important voices for the public, but they were not important in Parliament, and they were shunned by Labour MPs who wanted to get on. So what Blair did is he created a huge culture of fear, of patronage, and of people thinking, well, if we want to get on, we can't be dissenters. And that, I think, was a bit new. I think under previous Labour leaders and prime ministers, there had been a sense that they would sit on top of a broad church, that they were strong enough to take criticism from within their own ranks and so forth.
Okay, so I want to go back to a few things there. The patronage thing, it feels to me, having read Mike Mackessy's book about Kinnock, which I'm sure you know very well, it seems to me that there was a lot of patronage under Kinnock, because I think there's some point at which the book says the quickest way to get promotion was to be in the campaign group, to quit it and to denounce your former colleagues. And you went straight to the shadow cabinet. And it seems to me like a lot of what's happening now as well is about that. It's about trying to disable the dissent within Parliament and to neuter it. And it's been incredibly successful. I mean, if you look at the Socialist campaign group, they haven't even put a single tweet out in over a month. They stopped tweeting the day that Kim Johnson was told to apologise for her remarks about Israel.
Right.
And it seems to me they're terrified. And I don't want to excuse them at all. And they've obviously seen one of their members deselected as well, and attempts to deselect at least two others, serious attempts to deselect at least two others. But it feels to me like terror shouldn't be an excuse for like just not doing anything. And it feels to me like the left in Parliament isn't doing anything, or nothing visible, and that's a problem for us. But that's a success of what happened under Blair, Starmer and Kinnock to some extent. Maybe it's most successful under Starmer.
You're absolutely right. The patronage has always been there. The example you quote from the Marcus C. Heffernan book is interesting, because that's slightly different to patronage. That's rewarding turncoats, isn't it?
Yeah, true.
And there have always been rewards for turncoats. I think what Blair did so well, and Starmer is also doing, was create an atmosphere where anyone who got into Parliament or had hopes of getting into Parliament thought, I cannot speak out on anything. And so didn't become a member of the campaign group and then change, never got there, was always prepared to go along with whatever Blair wanted, even when they knew it was wrong. And obviously 139 Labour MPs voted against the Iraq war. But the others who didn't, most of them must have known it was wrong. In a sense, that's worse than voting for it if you believed it. Not just in a sense, it is worse than voting for a war because you actually believe that, you know, we're 45 minutes away from mass destruction. The campaign group now, it's a really difficult balance. And I don't want to say any individual is out of order or is too supine. I do note that John McDonnell has been, whenever there is another attack on Jeremy, and the most appalling one was Keir announcing about a month ago that Jeremy would not be a Labour candidate in Islington North or anywhere else. And John immediately put out a tweet announcing that. What the other campaign group members are doing is, I don't know. Obviously, John's been the vociferous one, and he's in the best position because
I think Diana's been more,
and Diana's been extremely outspoken. Actually, Diane Abbott. It's about which hill you die on, isn't it? If you're prepared that what is hanging over the campaign group MPs is, as you say, first of all, the threat of deselection. And the party machine tried very, very hard to deselect Ian Byrne in Liverpool. Massive credit to him and his party members that, you know, they rose up and they said, nonsense, he's a brilliant MP. And there was some talk, I think, of Zara Sultana, but she survived everything because, again, she's a brilliant MP. And then they did manage to deselect Sam Tarry, which, of course, slightly has its own history because the person who was going to be in the selection with him in 2019 had been suspended and was then back in the party. So there was some local stuff there. But of course they have deselected a left-wing MP, Sam Tarry. So they do have the threat of deselection hanging over them. They have the threat of suspension from Parliamentary Labour Party hanging over them, which, as we know, now obviously means that you, even if you've been selected by your Labour Party members, if you were subsequently suspended by the PLP, that you wouldn't be eligible to be a Labour Party candidate, despite what your local members had said. And at what point do you say enough is enough? And the cause, the thing that I am being prevented from speaking out on is so important that I know that I will risk my parliamentary career. And I am going to speak out on it. Or at what point, or do you say, well, I speak out on everything that I am not going to get disciplined for, and I'm going to be in the next parliament, maybe with the Labour government, and maybe where I can make a difference in the Labour government. Everyone has to come to their own decision about that. An awful lot of party members have taken the view that they absolutely speak out. The disciplining of Kim Johnson was shocking. That was really shocking. And the fact that we cannot have an honest discourse about Israel-Palestine is a shocking thing. The fact that criticism of the Israeli government is now routinely portrayed as anti-Semitism is a shocking thing. It's
good to have you on because I think you're much more sympathetic towards the Socialist campaign group than a lot of us are.
I'm sympathetic on a human level. I do understand that for each of them, they are trying to work out at what point they are potentially silenced. So the potential silence is so appalling that it means that they are not politically effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us are just a little bit more cynical because we've seen people fight so much for their jobs.
Yes.
And the fight, we want the fight that they have for their own personal careers to come into their politics more. And I think, or to be the fight that they have for Jeremy, and his I mean, not his career, but his position in Parliament.
I'm sympathetic on a human level, because I think they are placed in a very difficult situation. I would like to think that each time any of them speaks out on Israel, that they do so, and that they don't censor themselves.
So, okay, so let's talk about where we're at now. I've been chucked out of the Labour Party. Where are you, Liz?
Right. It's outrageous that you were chucked out. And remind me, I meant to look this up before we came in, but you were chucked out, first of all, a spurious suggestion of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, they couldn't get me on anti-Semitism. They accused me of it. But
they
obviously,
accused you of that, yes.
Yeah, I could have sued them. So in the end, they get you on this. It's not bringing the party into disrepute anymore. It's something like damaging the party's capacity to campaign against racism.
Prejudicial, that's right. But you were also chucked out for speaking about it.
So yeah, and I don't know whether that would have been crucial. I think they'd have forgiven me that one. But they did accuse me of going public, which is insane, isn't it? That you haven't got the right to talk about your own case.
It's really shocking, and I spend a lot of time helping members who are faced with notices of investigation or suspension, helping them to draft their letters and put their case and so forth. As a friend, I mean, I am a lawyer, but I'm not doing it as a lawyer. I'm doing it as a friend who knows the rule book fairly well, and can help them put their case effectively. And the intellectual dishonesty that happens with the Labour Party's disciplinary structures is just amazing. They will take half a tweet, they will take it out of context. I was involved in one case where there was a dispute about what had happened, and there were witnesses on both sides, and extraordinarily the group that was making the decisions decided that the case against that member was proved without having to have a hearing. They decided it on the papers. That would never happen in a court. There was actually a dispute of evidence, and they decided not to hear the evidence. That was gobsmacking, actually. The party member was saying, no, this is not true. This is what happened. Something else happened. And they just dismissed that account without hearing the evidence.
But that is how witch hunts work, isn't it? But they have this kind of aura of officialdom and processes and rules and things, but they're all absurd. I mean, none of them make sense. They're applied in whichever way people feel like it. There's a load of guilt by association that happens. And the more it continues, the more it kind of follows the kind of textbook witch hunt approach. It sort of seems remarkable to me that people don't use that language about it still.
No, it was a language we used all the time in the 80s and 90s. And I suppose maybe those of us who are from that time think that it became a bit hackneyed, that language. But it is a witch hunt, and it's absolutely the classic, if she drowns, she's not guilty. And if she doesn't drown, then she must be guilty. So you lose either way. And what is happening as a result of that atmosphere of fear is that some party members are being expelled, and you're one of them, outrageously. A lot of others are leaving, either in a sort of, they get angry and they post something, or they just don't renew their direct, they cancel their direct debit, and they're quiet. Now, I know that the figures show that party membership is now starting to creep up again. And I assume that is because people are hopeful that there'll be a Labour government, because the Tories are in disarray. And it feels like there will be a Labour government. I think principally because of what the government has done, the Tory government, rather than anything on Labour's side. So people are joining the Labour Party again, but they're not joining it with that sense of hope and inspiration. There's a grudging sense, I think. I suppose the other thing that just amazes me, and Blair didn't do, because Blair didn't expel large numbers of party members. Party members left, and the membership levels dropped dramatically under Blair, but he didn't actually expel them. But every Saturday, when I look at Twitter, usually in the afternoon, there are pictures of happy, they're often council candidates, saying they spent the Saturday morning talking to residents in such and such an area, and they hold up their red clipboards and red rosettes and things. And two things are noticeable. One is that the numbers of people in those photographs are far smaller than they were a few years ago. You and I were in those sorts of campaigning photographs a few years ago, and we'd all huddle to get in the photographs. There'd be 30 of us. And that those who are in the photographs tend to be the candidates. Obviously, you do expect candidates to be campaigning. But the other thing that strikes me is that on the one hand, Starmer is throwing members out, and on the other hand, we as existing members, and I'm still in the party, are being constantly exhorted to get on the doorstep to do our bit. And I don't think the professional politicians at the top of the tree actually get that everybody else in the Labour Party is a volunteer.
Thinking about those photos, sometimes the numbers are decent, but it's mainly councillors and ex-councillors, almost entirely. So you would get, so if you get a group of 8, it will be either councillors, ex-councillors, or future councillors would make up 7 of them, and you'd have like 1 or 2 other people alongside them. And I think that is something different. We actually got like groups that were majority, not people who wanted a career in any form at all out of the Labour Party, people whose politics wasn't tied to some kind of ego project. I mean, obviously there's lots of great councillors, I'm not knocking that, but for a lot of people, the canvassing is tied to a project where they want to progress their own self somehow.
Yes,
they see themselves doing it, and I think that absence of the grassroots is really, really striking. And the other thing that I was thinking when you were talking is about the use of exemplary cases. So like the way in which Blair used your case to put people off for applying. I really think like the high profile expulsions and exclusions and disciplining is being used to get rid of people, to silence people, to terrify people, and to make people like feel like they can't do anything, to feel like this is a different sort of party and they have to behave in a different sort of way. And so I think it's very, very significant for the culture. It creates a very oppressive culture in the party, from what people say to me who are still there.
And it creates an oppressive culture in social media as well. People are, and I mean, the role of social media is very interesting, because it wasn't there for either Kinnock or Blair in any effective way under Blair. Obviously, it was just coming in. But the fact that social media allows party officials and people who have individual grudges against party members, so I might hate you and therefore decide to trawl back to your Twitter feed to when you first came on Twitter, and report anything that might possibly be offensive or vaguely supportive of another party. If you'd retweeted Caroline Lucas, for example, or Nicola Sturgeon long before you were a member of the Labour Party, or anything on Israel-Palestine that would seem to cross the IHRA boundaries, all of that, or indeed actually anything on Israel-Palestine that the person looking probably didn't agree with, or thought the party wouldn't agree with. And the ability, pre-social media, those comments are made in the pub, in meetings where obviously you could have somebody writing down what everybody said, but that would be quite extreme. They're not they're not on the record in the same way, and they certainly don't stay on the record. So there is something very interesting politically about the obsession with trawling through social media and how outrageous it is, including the idea that if you like something, that means support. I mean, the definition of support is ludicrous.
Yeah, indeed. It's also ignorant of how social media works and how people use these, but deliberately, willfully.
Deliberately, yes. Yes, because a right-winger who, for example, had liked one of the Change UK MPs who stood as a Liberal Democrat in 2019 this is a current issue when we're making this video because they're just being readmitted, wouldn't be accused of supporting another political party, even though they had directly liked a candidate who was standing against Labour in 2019. And we know there are pictures of Alistair Campbell campaigning with Luciana Berger. Mike Gapes today has been readmitted into the Labour Party, and he stood against Labour in 2019. So there are absolutely extraordinarily double standards.
That is interesting because it ignores the logic, which is not really about whether you stood for another party or you supported someone standing for another party. The Labour, it's whether you supported the current direction of the Labour Party. And actually, if you join Change UK, you're very much in line with Keir Starmer. It was just another way of trying to destroy the left. And so it makes sense that they're readmitted.
It does. Yes.
The logic is obvious.
Yes.
That it's not running on the rules being applied consistently. And I think it's interesting when people like try to say, oh, but this is not consistent, because obviously it isn't. But then don't go the next step to saying the reason it's not consistent is because consistent with a different logic, which is not about how rules work, but it's about a kind of political witch hunt against certain groups.
It's politically consistent.
Yes.
It's not legally or as you say, on the basis of rules consistent, but it's utterly politically consistent. And we can see that Keir Starmer's announcement welcoming Mike Gapes back in today says it's now because we are the party of business and support for NATO. Now, Labour Party policy has always been support for NATO, but there have always been a sizable number of Labour Party members who don't agree with it, and that's been fine. Until recently, that has not been an issue. It's something that party members could disagree on, and the party leadership tried to block any attempt to change that policy. So the idea that support from NATO is now the totem by which you welcome people back into the Labour Party, and by implication exclude those of us who might still be in the Labour Party who don't support NATO.
It's really striking, like when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, he was elected on, I think, a platform of three things, like economic justice, democracy and human rights. And Keir Starmer's Labour Party, he recites often these three things, which is support for NATO and patriotism, support for business, and opposition to anti-Semitism. And it's kind of, that is what it is. And all those things just stand for the establishment.
They stand for the establishment. They stand for saying, I am not Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes.
And they stand for saying to the establishment, look, I am a safe pair of hands, which fits completely with the fact that 13 years of Tory government and that's now crumbling. And so the establishment needs a different safe pair of hands. Wes Streeting was almost honest about it. I think it was yesterday. He said something about the Tories need some time in opposition so they can regroup or something. I mean, this is just the establishment going, okay, we can no longer rely on the Tories, but look, Labour's fine, which is exactly what happened in 1997. Exactly what happened in 1997. I suppose the other thing, and to me, this is one of the most heartbreaking things, is that in 2015, with all that euphoria, and suddenly we start to have a mass membership of the Labour Party. And I naively thought, well, this is great. We have people here who are politically inspired. Most have had some background of political activity. Others not, but were inspired by Jeremy and what he stood for. And if it had been an honest party, then all of that talent would have been put to use. There would, of course, have been debates in the Labour Party about how far even Jeremy Corbyn's policies should become the official policies of the Labour Party. But if it had been an honest process, we'd have had those debates, we'd have had them over time, we'd have run with the policies where an incoming Labour government could rapidly make a difference. So wealth, with starting to tackle wealth inequality, tackling the housing crisis, tackling the social care crisis, and developing a foreign policy based around, as you say, democracy and human rights, and not invading other countries. And we'd have done all that if it had been an honest process. And we may well have come up with a number of policies that you and I would still have disagreed with, but the majority of Labour Party members would have wanted. That's fair enough, but it would have been an honest process, and we never had that honest process, and now we have no chance of it whatsoever.
Yeah. Okay. So where does that leave us? What's the left doing in that situation? The situation, as you say, there's no chance for this process. The chances are it looks almost inevitable for the reasons you say that Labour will win at the election, probably with a decent majority. Yeah,
maybe it depends what happens in Scotland, I think.
True. Yeah. So what do we do?
I think it's very difficult. I think the chances of the left running the Labour Party have been taken away from us for a generation, and all of the appalling disciplinary stuff that we have just discussed, including keeping well-liked local candidates off long lists and short lists for parliamentary seats, or even former MPs such as Emma Don't-Coad off those short lists. That's been very tightly managed, and that is all about the current administration of the Labour Party making sure that a Jeremy Corbyn can never happen again. Yeah. That the parliamentary Labour Party will not nominate Jeremy Corbyn. That 20% of them won't nominate the new Jeremy Corbyn, whoever that new Jeremy Corbyn might happen to be. And I'm not terribly interested in, who's the best in the campaign group, etc. But that moment is not going to happen again. We need new moments. This sounds terribly, I haven't got inspirational thoughts. What I do know is that I left the Labour Party in 2001 because I thought Blair had changed it irrecoverably, and I was wrong about that, because we got Jeremy in. My defence is, nobody said to me in 2001, if you hold on, in 14 years' time, Jeremy Corbyn will be leader of the Labour Party. No one said that. But what that shows is that you can't. None of us have a crystal ball. You can't predict what's going to happen. Unexpected things happen. Sharon Graham, for example, winning the Unite leadership was to me an unexpected thing. I hadn't spotted just how strong her campaign was and how much support she had at the grassroots. We have, what's happening with the public sector strikes and the unions is inspiring at the moment. God knows what that will mean if that continues under a Labour government, because of course then there are huge pressures. I'm staying in the Labour Party unless I'm subsequently thrown out. If I am. At the moment I'm staying in by my fingertips for a number of reasons, and the principal reason is that when I was outside of the Labour Party, I tried some to build an electoral left force, and it didn't work. And I learned a lot from that. One of them was that it's very hard to get the left outside the Labour Party together and united. And the second one is that it's very hard to break the habit of people who are progressive from voting Labour, and hard to persuade them to vote something else, particularly under first past the post. So I think it would be very, very difficult to build a new electoral alternative. And that's the main reason why I am staying in the Labour Party. I also happen now to be in a very small Labour Party in a safe Tory seat in New Forest West. And because we're in a safe Tory seat, then these appalling fights have not hit us, and there are good people there. And some of them are running for council, and I want to support them. But I don't know. I don't know what is going to happen. What I do know is that if you're on the left, you have to carry on being active. But that doesn't mean that you have to be active in the Labour Party. It means that you pick your issues, and sometimes you pick single issues, climate change or whatever it happens to be. Other times you say, actually electoral politics is so important that I'm going to try and do what I can to get a progressive government in. I think we just, and the third area, of course, is trade union activity. So I think we have to hang on to whatever we are doing And whatever we like doing politically, it's quite important that political activity should not be a burden, it should be an inspiration, and help to pave the way for, you know, a more progressive future.